Thank you, Dr. Jackman, for those very kind words, and Dean Lindermeyer for the welcome. It's a delight to be here. I'm really honored to help kick off the CBEST New Center. I want to start with a brief introduction about what biodiversity is. You probably heard this term very often, but what does it actually mean? And it turns up, if you Google it or look it up in the textbook, there are many long, complicated definitions. But probably, to me, the most useful definition of biodiversity is the simplest one. It's simply the variation among living organisms in the world around us. Now, if you think about it, the living world varies in many different ways. For example, there is the variation within a species. If we look around this room at our own species, we're quite familiar with how variable a species can be, but it turns out many species in nature are similarly variable. For example, here's a species of snail from Europe showing the great variation in shell color. In addition, there's a lot of variation among species, closely related species that are similar, but show differences such as in their color or the shape of their beak and so on. And finally, there's a variation that occurs within ecosystems, the species that live together that make the world function. And so as a result, biodiversity is multidimensional with many different facets. And as a result, it needs to be studied, or it can be studied in many different ways. And I have to say that's a reason that I'm very impressed with the new center here, the Center for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Stewardship, because it brings together biologists studying the world, the living world in many different ways, and is the synthesis of those approaches that I think makes this center so powerful and so likely to help advance our understanding of biodiversity, much less our ability to predict what might, or to help conserve nature moving forward in the future. So I'm very honored to be selected to be the speaker for this inaugural event. It's a great honor to me. And so I'd like to tell you a little bit of my research, which in some ways illustrates some of the different ways that we can study biological diversity. And so that's the story I will talk about today. But this story has a second aspect to it, or a second theme, and it actually shows how my research has developed throughout my career. And for those of you who are just getting started or thinking about getting started in biology, perhaps it's a useful lesson in how things change and how you start out doing one thing and you end up studying something very different without ever intending to do so, or just how the quirks and unpredictable events in your life can change how your research develops. So this is me in my younger days. I think one look at these pictures will tell you that that was a long time ago. This is when I was an undergraduate or early in graduate school. And I remember a particular event when I was a junior in college. And I went to a talk by this man here, John Endler, a scientist at that time at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And he did research on guppies. Now, all of you are probably familiar with guppies from pet stores or perhaps your own aquarium, but I bet very few of you know where guppies come from naturally. Does anyone know? Well, the answer is Trinidad. Yes, I heard it in the front row from a biologist. Guppies live in Trinidad and in Venezuela, where they occur in streams, often in mountains. And it turns out that they are very colorful in some places in those streams, but they're not colorful everywhere. In other parts of the stream, they're quite drab in color. And so Endler went out to try to figure out why they varied so greatly in color. And I should point out that this is mostly in males. And what he found is that in places where this larger fish called the pike cichlid occurred, this is a predatory fish, at those sites the guppies were quite bland, whereas in sites without that predator or other predators they were quite colorful. And so his idea was that on the one hand, for some reason, female guppies love a colorful male. Now we don't know why that is, but it turns out to be correct, that females prefer colorful males. And in the absence of predators, the idea was that males would evolve colors under the process of sexual selection. However, in the presence of predators, the predators also can see those colorful males, and the predators pick them off, and so only the drab males would be able to survive. Well, that was what Endler surmised from his observations. It was a correlation between colorful males, an inverse correlation between colorful males and lack of predators. But as we all know, correlation does not prove causation, and the gold standard in science is to do an experiment. And so Endler did an experiment. What he did was he took a drab population of guppies in a pool where there were predators, and he simply moved them to an empty stream a little bit higher in the mountains where there were no predators. And his prediction was that if in fact the absence of predators allowed colorful males to exist, then they should evolve to become more colorful. That's his prediction. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. Over just a couple of years, the guppies evolved to become much more colorful. He actually did this experiment several times, both in laboratory pools and in nature, and got the same result every time. Well, this was an extraordinary result that really shook up the evolutionary biology world, because what it suggested was that you could actually test ideas about evolution in real time doing experiments, something that people had never occurred to them that you could do an experiment on evolution, because we all thought that evolution was much too slow to observe in real time. But actually, at the same time that Endler did this experiment, scientists were beginning to doubt that idea. For example, pretty much at the same time, the famous Princeton University biologists Peter and Rosemary Grant were studying Darwin's finches in the Galapagos. And what they observed is that in years of extreme rain or extreme drought, the finches actually evolved changes in their beak size to correspond to what seeds were available. And they actually saw evolution occur from one year to the next. Now, these observations that evolution could occur rapidly in nature corresponded with what we knew from the lab. People for many decades had been doing studies on fruit flies and other organisms where you would select on some trait, say in a fruit fly. Say you selected on the number of bristles on the butt of a fruit fly. So you just took the ones with the most bristles and only let them breed. And what you would find is very quickly that population would evolve to have more bristles. And it turns out you could select on almost any trait in fruit flies or other organisms and get a rapid evolutionary response in the lab. So we knew that for many decades, but people thought, well, that's just in the lab. It doesn't occur in nature. But we actually were beginning to see that this occurs in nature as well. You're probably familiar with the famous moth example from England, where when the Industrial Revolution occurred, the moths quickly evolved to be dark to be better camouflaged against trees. And in fact, we're quite aware of this effect with species evolving to adapt to the poisons that we've tried to control them with, pesticides, herbicides, and so on, and rats and flowers and beetles evolve resistance to these pesticides. And in fact, we're all familiar with the evolution of resistance in antibiotics. And so what the field came to realize is that when natural selection is strong, when there's the opportunity to survive if you have new traits, evolution routinely and rapidly can lead to evolutionary change. And so what was particularly important to evolutionary biologists was not only the realization that evolution occurs rapidly, but you could actually study it in real time. You could watch evolution occur. You could even do experiments. That is what was so exciting about Endler's work with guppies. You could come up with ideas about evolution, but test them experimentally. Well, that was the message I got when I heard this talk by Endler as a junior in college. Fast forward a few years, I went to graduate school, I studied lizards, and I ended up doing experimental studies of my own. And so that's the topic of my talk today, experimental studies of evolution in the Bahamas. It will be a talk in 4 acts, if you will. First, about adaptation to different environments, then the role of interspecific competition in causing evolution, then the effect of predation, and finally something called founder effects and how we could test those ideas. And if I talk quickly enough, I have an encore of some recent work. We'll see if I get to that. I need to acknowledge my collaborators. This has been a long-going project. Initially, my postdoctoral advisor, Tom Shaner at UC Davis, and his long-term research associate, Dave Spiller. In addition, 2 of my former graduate students, Manuel Leal and Jason Colby, now professors at the University of Missouri and the University of Rhode Island. So let's get started. Act 1, adaptation to different environments. Now, during my PhD, this is the prologue, and during my PhD, I looked at the evolutionary relationships of species to understand how traits had evolved. You here are probably familiar with the work of Aaron Bauer and Todd Jackman looking at the relationships of geckos and understanding how their toe pads have evolved by building what's called a phylogeny and then mapping traits on this phylogeny. I did very similar work looking at the evolutionary relationships of the lizards I study, the Anole lizards, to understand the evolution of hind limb length. And what we determined based on the evolutionary relationships is that long legs and short legs had evolved many times, that species using broad surfaces tend to have long legs because it lets them run faster and jump farther, whereas species using narrow surfaces evolve short legs, which allows them to creep carefully without falling off on narrow, irregular surfaces. And the evolutionary relationships indicates that this relationship has evolved multiple times. However, just as in the example with the guppies I mentioned before, this was just a correlation. It suggested that there was a causal relationship between using different size surfaces and evolving legs, but that's all it was, a correlation. Now put that aside for a moment, and let me tell you about a paper I read in graduate school. It was by Tom Shaner and his then wife, Amy, at the University of California, Davis, where they did an experiment with this species here, the brown anole, Anolis sagari. He's going to be the hero of much of this talk, this species. It occurs in Cuba and throughout the Bahamas. And the Shaners did a project in the middle of the Bahamas on a tiny little island called Staniel Key. And what they observed was that there were very small islands around Staniel Key that lacked lizards. And so these are, let's see if I can get this. These are these tiny little islands here. Here's a map showing some of them. It's these small islands. Look at the legend here. This is a kilometer. So these are small islands. These are tiny islands. These are islands the size of this room. And these islands naturally did not have lizards on them. And so the Shaners wanted to understand why the lizards couldn't exist on these small islands. And in particular, they wanted to study the process of extinction, something we didn't know much about then and we still need to know more about today. And so what they did is they took a handful of lizards and put them on each one of these tiny little islands, expecting them to go extinct because naturally they didn't occur there. What they found, however, was surprising. This shows whether the population survived or not on these islands. And what they found was, that I'm lasering myself, what they found was that on the very tiny islands, the populations went extinct. But at islands that are 10 square meters or larger, 10 square meters is maybe the size of this stage, any island larger than that, the lizard populations survived for several years. Now we'll come back later to why the lizard populations aren't on these islands if they could survive there. But more importantly, what they had done is that they had put lizards on a lot of islands and the lizards were surviving. So I contacted Shaner as a graduate student, and I said to Shaner, I'm guessing that these islands differ in their vegetational characteristics. In fact, I was correct about that. Some of them were bushy with small trees that were of some size. Some of the islands were quite scrubby with very narrow vegetation. And so I said to Shaner, my research has shown that lizards that use narrow surfaces evolve short legs, whereas ones on broad surfaces evolve long legs. You have inadvertently done an experiment where you put lizards all from one population onto these islands, and my prediction is on the different islands, they will evolve different length legs. Have you ever thought of that? And of course, deep down, so I'm finishing graduate school, towards the end of my PhD, I'm thinking, boy, I'd love to do this project. And he answers in the way that I could only have hoped in 1,000 years, but never really expected. He said, that's a great idea. Why don't you come do a postdoc and study that? And so I did. And lesson to that, it never hurts to ask. That's what I took away from that. So very quickly, I was in the Bahamas measuring the lizards. This is what the research looked way back then. I'm sitting in my handy chair. We've captured lizards. I've got a little what's called a monoscope where I'm measuring the lizard right there on the island, measuring how long its legs are, and then letting them go again. And so the hypothesis was that on islands with broader surfaces, they would have longer legs. They'd been on these islands, I should say, about 15 years. And here's the result. And I plotted it backwards. The X and Y axis should be reversed. But what we found is exactly what was predicted, that on the islands with broad surfaces, they had long legs, whereas on the islands with narrow surfaces, each point is an average for an island, they had shorter legs. It suggested that the lizards had evolved exactly as we had predicted over the course of 15 years to adapt to the surfaces that we were that they occurred with. So we were, of course, extremely excited about this, and we wrote the paper up, and it got published in Nature, which is a very prestigious journal. Nature is not only prestigious, but they put out press releases, and they decided to feature our article that week, and they put out a press release which said this: this may be among the most important work in evolutionary studies since Darwin studied the diversity of finches on the Galapagos Islands during the voyage of the Beagle. Well, it was a nice study, but I mean, this was way over the top. And it so happened that we were back in the Bahamas when this press release went out, and we were staying at this little place called the Lofty Fig. And at the very last moment, I had put on, this is, pre-internet was barely existing then. I put on my answering machine, if you need to reach me, call the manager of this motel, because they didn't have phones in the rooms. And so anyway, Nature puts out that press release, and the media goes wild. And I come back one day from the field, and the manager says, the New York Times wants to talk to you. And the next day it was the USA Today and the Boston Globe want to talk to you. And then ABC News that almost flew in a crew to film us in the field doing our stuff. And the manager was really annoyed because he didn't want his phone tied up, but he also couldn't believe that anyone cared about these nutcases who were catching lizards. But anyway, we got incredible publicity about this paper, and it certainly did wonderful things for my career, getting all that attention. However, when I gave talks when the paper came out, there was one problem, and it was those pesky botanists. There was always a botanist in the audience who basically said, have you ever thought about phenotypic plasticity? Well, phenotypic plasticity is the phenomenon that individuals that are genetically identical may grow in different ways depending on the environment. And so you can imagine with plants, if you put it in a cool, shady area, most plants won't grow as much as one that's well watered in a nice sunny area, and so on. And so organisms often, their phenotype is a result not only of their genes, but also the environment in which they grow. And you can think about just in humans. You give someone a terrible diet, they will develop cavities, they probably won't grow as well. So that is called phenotypic plasticity. We know it occurs a lot in plants, and so people ask, have you considered the possibility that lizards that grow up using narrow surfaces simply grow shorter legs, that they're not genetically different, it's just phenotypic plasticity for limb length? Well, it seemed like a ridiculous idea, but I kept on getting the question, so I decided I'd better look into it. And so I went to look up the literature on the effect of diameter on limb growth in lizards. And it turned out that was very easy because there was no literature. No one had ever studied that before. However, there was a somewhat relevant literature on exercise in various animals where, I must say this is among the most bizarre set of studies that I've ever read. And I said this once, and someone in the audience actually did those studies, so I hope no one here does that. But they did things like they made a mouse run on a wheel for 10 hours a day, whereas the control group got no exercise. Or they dunked a rat in a bathtub and made it tread water for 4 hours, and again the control did nothing. And so the idea is, would this exercise, these were, I should say, these were young mice and rats that were growing. The idea is, would all of this exercise affect their bones and make them grow their legs differently? Or they put chickens on treadmills and made them run for many hours a day. Now, you're saying to yourself, that is not a chicken. I know it's not a chicken, but I couldn't find a picture of a chicken on a treadmill. However, once I gave this talk, and by the time the talk was over, someone gave me this picture that she had gotten her friend to take to illustrate that. Anyway, it turns out that what these studies show that actually if you make an animal exercise a lot as it's growing up, it does affect its bones. And in particularly, the limb bones are thicker. And it turns out, I wasn't aware of this back then, that bone is a very dynamic substance. And if you put more stress on a bone, particularly when you're growing, it will lay down more bone because more bone is needed to deal with all the stress and strain on it. And so these studies often found that the animals that were forced to exercise had thicker bones, which is interesting. However, we hadn't looked at the diameter of the bones, we had looked at the length of the bones, and with almost no exceptions, none of the studies had found a difference in limb length, with one interesting exception. And that was a study on human tennis players that had looked at professional tennis players. And if you think about a professional tennis player, these players have spent their entire growing up lives smacking tennis balls hour after hour every day. And so the question was, does that cause their arm to be longer? And fortuitously, each individual served as his own control because you have their hitting arm and your other arm. Sure enough, tennis players have longer serving arms than their non-serving arms. And these were done with x-rays. It wasn't that the arm was just hanging lower. The bones were actually longer. Now, some of you may be saying that there is another explanation. It may not be that hitting the tennis balls causes your arm to grow longer. It may be the other way around, that people with asymmetric arms end up being professional tennis players. That's possible. But in any case, it suggested the possibility that their phenotypic plasticity in limb length could occur. Now, of course, that's a long leap from human tennis players to lizards growing up on different surfaces, but we decided to do an experiment. And what we did, this experiment was done at the St. Louis Zoo, is we got baby brown anoles, Anole sagrii, and we let them grow up in aquaria with two treatments. In one treatment, they were on broad 2x4s. And this is a happy lizard. This is what these lizards normally do. It's sitting, its legs are spread out, and you can just see this is a content, very happy lizard. This is not a happy lizard. He's got a hunkered down, he's hanging on. They definitely had different postures growing up in the two environments. Well, here's what we found. First, we found, once we subtracted out the difference of size, that males have longer hind limbs than females. We already knew that. It's a sexually dimorphic trait. But what we also found is that the ones that grew up on narrow surfaces had shorter legs, corrected for body size, than the ones on broad surfaces. So it was actually a phenotypically plastic trait, much to our amazement. In fact, we were so surprised we did the experiment twice, and other people subsequently have done it as well. And it is true that the surface that a lizard grows up on and all the activities that change as a result do affect how long the limbs change. And in the subsequent years, the 20 years since this work has been done, the field has come to realize that phenotypic plasticity in animals, I think, is much more common than we used to believe. So certainly part of our experiment, there may be a phenotypic plasticity element to it. However, nonetheless, if you look at the amount of plasticity, there we go. This is the amount of change in our experiment, that much. And this was a pretty dramatic difference from lizards basically flat out to hanging on. That's as much plasticity as we could produce. And this is the variation among our islands. So that suggests that even though plasticity does occur, probably most of what we were observing was genetic differences. Now I can tell you, 20 years on, we are finally close to actually isolating what the genes responsible for differences in limb length actually are, although maybe not quite that close. But hopefully before too long, we'll be able to actually look at the genes and actually see if there are genetic differences. And we certainly look forward to doing that. But with that, I'm going to switch to the second act in the play, which is looking at interspecific competition. That is, the interactions between two species and how they might affect evolution. To do that, we moved slightly to the south in the Bahamas to the Great Exumas, working out of the town of Georgetown. And we add a second player to our act now, the brown anole and the green anole, Anolis smaragdinus. Again, we worked on small islands that didn't naturally contain lizards. And we basically found 15 islands that were empty, and we broke them into groups of 3 similar islands. So we had 5 sets of 3 islands. Within each set, one island was randomly selected to get green anoles, one island was selected to get brown anoles, and one island got both. And so the question was, do the species do better when they're by themselves? Or, in other words, do the species affect each other? We could compare each species alone versus in the presence of the other. And so our question was, can brown anoles survive on these small islands? Can green anoles survive? And if they can survive, is there any evidence that they interact with each other negatively? So first, can brown anoles survive? We introduced 5 lizards to each island. As you can see, the lizards did very well. In 1 year, they at least doubled, and some of them really exploded in population size. 3 years in, 9 out of the 10 populations are doing very well. And this population subsequently rebounded. What about green anoles? Well, the story there is a little bit different. After the first year, most of the populations did all right, but after 3 years, 4 of the populations have gone extinct, and another 2 of them are down to a single individual, in both cases a male, so that's not looking very good for the population. So this suggests that perhaps green anoles aren't found on these small islands because they just can't hack it there. But finally, the third question, the key question, is there evidence for the species interacting? Now this is a little complicated, but this shows the 5 islands, and on each island it shows the density of the green anoles with and without the brown anoles. The red color is the green anole by itself, the yellow color is in the presence of the brown anole. And what we see in the middle of the experiment, when times are good, in all 5 sets, the red line is higher. indicating that when they're by themselves, the green anole density is greater than when they're with the brown anoles. In other words, the presence of brown anoles has a negative effect on green anoles. The species are interacting with each other. And so I think we can understand why the green anoles aren't on these islands, because one, they can't seem to survive very well anyway, and then if you have brown anoles on the islands, it makes it even worse. But why don't we find brown anoles on these islands, just as we didn't find them in the first study that Shaner did? Well, Shaner had pointed out, well, I should say that Shaner had been working in the islands since the early 1970s, and he had in some senses the misfortune to start working there just when there was a natural lull in hurricanes. And so, although he had suggested in his original paper that it is hurricanes that keep lizards off these islands, that periodic hurricanes wash them away, and that's why the populations aren't there, because even if they establish themselves, they get washed away. But he never got the chance to test that idea because just no hurricanes came along. Until that is 1996. This is Hurricane Lily. It's churning its way across Cuba, and it's a Category 2 hurricane, so not a particularly bad one. I should point out that hurricanes go more slowly over land than they do over water. Now, this hurricane was headed straight towards our study site in Georgetown. And I have to say we had mixed feelings about this, because on the one hand, we had long thought that hurricanes were an important piece of the puzzle that we hadn't been able to test their importance. And so finally, a hurricane would hit our populations, we could see what happened. So that's good. The bad news is we were on the islands at the time. So we followed the course of the hurricanes, and as soon as it left Cuba, it took a hard turn to the east, and so it was going to miss us. And then it turns right back. And it comes closer and closer, and it scored a direct hit. Here are our study islands right there. It went straight over it. We saw the eye of the storm go over. Well, here's what the hurricane caused. There were many trees that were uprooted and snapped off. We counted 17 yachts that were sunk in the harbor, and it had a pretty massive effect. Now, I should point out that just by good fortune, we had just concluded our surveys for the year. So we knew how many lizards were on each island, what the islands were like. Really, we finished 2 days before the hurricane came. So we were able right away, well, 2 days later, our boat, somehow I failed to get a picture of our motorboat in a tree, but it ended up in a tree. We pulled it out and we went back to look at the islands. Now, the hurricane had come from the southwest. Here we are in Georgetown. So our islands were arrayed on both sides of Great Exuma. So we started first on the far side, the northeastern side, and we went back to the islands, and what we found in recensusing the populations of the lizards is clearly something had happened. The populations were down by a third to 40%. Also, just the islands themselves, it was clear something had happened. The vegetation was messed up, leaves were stripped off, branches were broken. Clearly something had happened, but by the same effect, it was clearly a quantitative effect. It wasn't catastrophic. And so this was after, this was on the other side of Great Exuma, but Great Exuma is only 1 mile wide, and that's not enough time to slow down the hurricane appreciably. We then went to the islands in the southwest in the forefront of the storm. This is my favorite island from that study. It's an island, the one island that green anoles were thriving 3 years into the study. If you walked through these bushes are about this high, if you walked through the island, green anoles were just flying out everywhere like little crickets. They were all over the island. So we went back out to check out these islands. This is the same island. It's like a bomb hit it. In fact, we weren't sure we were in the right place. All of the vegetation essentially is gone. Here's another island. That's a tree that was snapped in half. It was a 10-foot tall tree, and the tree's gone. All the vegetation's gone. Here's another island, the same story. So these islands had been hammered by the hurricane. So we went out to measure the lizards on these islands, and that turned out to be easy. There were no lizards left at all. So the hurricane had removed the lizards from these islands. So we had confirmed Shaner's conjecture that, in fact, hurricanes are responsible for these islands being empty. But that does leave one last question, which is, why was the effect so great on one set of islands and not on the other? And as I said, the wind speed really should have been the same on both sets of islands. Well, there was one clue, and that was on the islands in the southwest, which were wiped out. We saw this. Now, this is a starfish. I don't know if you guys are taught marine biology here, but starfish do not live on the tops of islands. What had happened is the islands had been underwater. The storm surge from the hurricane had basically hit the islands with great force, probably stripping a lot away, and then the islands were underwater for about 6 hours. Then the storm surge hit Great Exuma, which is high enough that it stopped the storm surge, and the islands on the other side, there wasn't enough open water to build up a storm surge. And so presumably that is what causes the effect of these hurricanes. It's not the winds itself, but the storm surge. Well, with that, we now move to Act 3, which is looking at another ecological process, and that is predation. And an important question in community ecology, particularly in the last couple of decades, is the role that predation plays in structuring communities and possibly in driving evolution. So once again, we moved to a different part of the Bahamas. We moved up to the north to the island of Abaco, the town of Marsh Harbor. And we add another player to the story, and that is this lizard here, the curly-tailed lizard. It's a larger lizard than anoles, and it was known that it eats brown anoles. But what we didn't know is whether it does it every once in a while and doesn't really have much of an impact, or whether the curly tails eat so many brown anoles that it has a major effect on their biology. And so we decided to do another experiment. This time we started with larger islands on which brown anoles occurred naturally, and we introduced these predators, curly tail lizards, to some of the islands and not others. Now I should point out that curly tail lizards occur naturally in the area, that if I'm on one of these islands without curly tails, right over there is an island with curly tails, or right over there. They live in the area. We've actually seen them colonize these islands naturally. So we are mimicking a process that goes on all the time. Now, I had the great fortune to work with the Howard Hughes Medical Institute that made a short film about this research, and so they do a better job of explaining it than I do, so I'm going to play a little clip from the movie. I do want to say one thing, though. They refer to my colleagues in this clip as Jonathan's team. I objected to that. They were my collaborators and colleagues, but they refused to. They put them all in the credit. So the people I mentioned in the beginning, Tom Shaner, Dave Spiller, Jason Colby, and Manuel Leal, all contributed really pretty much equally to this work. So let's go to the film.
Jonathan wondered if he could also create an experiment that would lead natural selection to favor longer legs. He found islands that already had a nose that lived primarily on the ground. His team caught and measured each lizard. Then he brought in a predator, a species of larger curly-tailed lizards that eat anoles. Here's the factoid of our experiment. This is the curly-tailed lizard. Now, what we did is we added them to half of our eggs. These are very voracious predators. What we wanted to know was, what effect would this guy have on the anole on the island? Would the anoles evolve longer legs to run faster, or larger body size to defend themselves?
Yes, good question. Sorry, I was daydreaming. Well, here's what happened. We started the experiment in the spring, and so the islands without the curly tails, the population goes way up. These are the babies being born. But on the islands with the curly tails, a much more muted response. And very quickly, basically a twofold difference in population size was created that was maintained throughout the experiment. So very clearly, the curly tails are affecting the population of the brown anoles. Moreover, the brown anoles are no dummies. I forgot to mention, curly tails are basically terrestrial lizards. And so as soon as the curly tails showed up, the brown anoles started shifting higher into the vegetation. Now, I can't explain to you why their perch height got higher and higher every generation or every sampling period, but clearly these brown anoles know to get up off the ground to avoid the curly tails. So then what happened is this. Another hurricane, Hurricane Floyd, our study site is right there, and the populations were not completely wiped out, but pretty much devastated by the hurricane. And we had to wait 4 years to start the experiment again. But we did, Predation Experiment Part 2. And again, we introduced curly tails to 6 islands using another 6 as controls, but this time we did something different based on what we had already found. And that is, before putting the curly tails on the islands, we went out and measured as many of the brown anoles as we could catch, measured how long their legs were, and then we injected them with a non-toxic little rubbery surface underneath their legs to give each individual its own identification marker. So for example, this lizard has lime green in its left upper forearm and you can sort of see the reddish color in its right femur. So each lizard had its own, similar to bird bands. And so we knew each lizard and how long its legs were. And the question was, we would come back later, see who had survived, and then ask whether survival was related to limb length. So let's go back to the video.
After 6 months, he returned and discovered that on average, the survivors did have longer legs. They were better able to elude their foe. But after 12 months, Jonathan's team returned again and discovered that now most of the lizards were living high in the bushes to escape the predators. And on average, the survivors had shorter legs. Generation after generation, it will be up in the bushes, the shorter-legged lizards will do better, and we expect the population to evolve shorter legs. Jonathan had seen how predation could create strong selective pressures for longer legs on the ground and shorter legs in the bushes.
So briefly to recap this study, what we found is, as we had found before, in the presence of the predators, the brown anoles spend much less time on the ground. They're up in the bushes. And then we measured what is called a selection gradient, which is the difference in limb length between the survivors and the non-survivors. That if the survivors had longer legs than the non-survivors, you would have a positive selection gradient. If the survivors had shorter legs, you would have a negative selection gradient. And if there was no difference, the selection gradient would be 0. What we found was, initially, in the presence of curly-tailed lizards, long legs were favored, whereas in the absence, there was no selection. This presumably is because the longer-legged ones, which run faster, were surviving better. But we also know that the lizards were moving up into the trees, into the bushes, and from previous work, we know that when you get higher up, you start using narrower surfaces. So they're using narrower surfaces in the presence of curly tails, and we know what narrow surfaces select for Anolis lizards. That's shorter legs. And what we found, to our surprise that it happened so quickly, is that in the second sampling period, now selection was favoring shorter legs, because once they're up in the bushes, they need the shorter legs to be able to move efficiently. Now, we were very excited about, this is only within one generation. There's no evolution here, it's just who's surviving. But now the lizards are stuck up in the bushes, those in the presence of curly tails. So we imagined generation after generation, shorter-legged ones would be surviving, and we thought that they could very well turn into twig anoles. They would evolve shorter legs. So we were very excited about this, the possibility. Now, I don't think you can guess what happened next. Anyone want to try? A hurricane. No. 2 hurricanes. 3 weeks apart. The poor people in the area got battered. The lizard populations got battered. Sadly, the experiment was again delayed for several years. We've started it again, but now we've been hit by 4 hurricanes in the last decade. So maybe someday we'll get more on whether they actually do evolve shorter legs in the presence of predators, but I can't tell you any more on that right now. Now, I just want to briefly, one aside to say that in addition to looking at how one focal species is affected by competitors or predators, another thing that ecologists look at is the ecosystem consequences of species interactions. And that actually is one of the things that CBEST here is particularly strong at. And 4 of the 6 researchers in the center are world experts in ecosystems, how they function, how changing environments and conditions change those ecosystems. And I only mention that to say that we have looked at that a little bit. We found, I'm not going to go through this slide, but when you have anoles, that affects the insects that are present, that in turn affects the vegetation, and so there are lots of ramifying consequences of the presence of lizards and then the presence of their predators, and it's an important area of research. We haven't done that much on that, but it's certainly an area that this group here in Villanova is excellent in. So finally, the last act is something called founder effects, and this is attributed to the great evolutionary biologist Ernst Mayr. And it is his idea. He suggested that one reason that islands often have very different, that the plants and animals on islands often are very different from those on mainlands, is that islands are often colonized by very few individuals that are genetically different from their source population. I mean, imagine if 2 individuals from this room got stranded on an island and started a new population. Well, they might be very average individuals, and that population might be normal, but it might be two very extreme individuals with different phenotypes, and the population might be different just as a result of the individuals that founded the population, hence the term founder effect. Now, this was a very influential idea of Meyer's. It's been very controversial in recent years. I would say that many people actually have begun to think that it's not an important evolutionary process, but it has never actually been tested in nature experimentally. And so we decided to take advantage of these hurricanes clearing off islands to do an experiment that I long wanted to do, which was basically to take a bunch of islands, and on each island put 2 lizards there, so potentially creating a founder effect. Now, you're not supposed to say that. We're supposed to have hypotheses we're testing, but really, I just wanted to see what happened. What would happen? Would we get to see it? So the question is, would the population survive? Would we see a founder effect in their genetics and their morphology? And would it persist through time? How would it interact with adaptive divergence? So what we did is we found 7 tiny little scrubby islands, and we took lizards from the forest in the background. We went to the forest, we collected a bunch of lizards, and just put a male and a female on each of 7 islands. And here's what the islands look like. They're very small, they're very scrubby, so narrow vegetation. We can predict how they should adapt. And so here's what happened. We start with 2 lizards. All 7 populations, as you can see, thrive. Within a couple of years, they had all gotten up to at least 10 individuals, some up to 40 individuals. We can look at the genetics, and I'm not going to go through this in detail. Suffice it to say that the black dot here is the mean genetic constitution of the source population, and these 7 colored dots are the 7 experimental populations. And you can see they're not, for the most part, clustering. They have changed from the source population. That is a founder effect. Just by creating 2 individuals, we've changed the genetic constitution, and those differences remained true for a few years. So we slightly, the second year of the study, the same colors, slightly paler, show that they're in the same place. And then 3 years out, I changed the axes, but you can see this founder effect in genetics actually has persisted at least for a few years. And it's actually, if you do statistics, a very big genetic difference just caused by starting populations with 2 different individuals. We were also interested in their morphology, and times had changed since that first study I showed you in the early days. No longer am I sitting in a plastic chair on the islands measuring the lizards with a ruler. We now had an X-ray machine that we took with us in the field, my favorite piece of equipment ever. So we would capture the lizards, bring them back into the field lab, and take an X-ray of them, and so we could much more accurately measure them. And it turns out when you take an X-ray of lizards, you see all kinds of other cool things you wouldn't imagine or expect. For example, this lizard here, those are snails that it ate. I didn't even know they ate snails. Now here, this you may not be able to see, but that is an egg. This is a gravid female. She's soon going to lay her egg. And this one here, can anyone figure out what that is? Starfish. It's not a starfish. It's a baby lizard's head. This guy has eaten a smaller individual of the same species, and there's, if you look carefully, there's its backbone. So all kinds of cool things on the X-ray machine. Here's a bunch of lizards that had their forelegs bitten off. We don't know why, but one year there was a lot of this going on. Anyway, cool stuff with the X-ray machine. We also put the lizards on a scanner to look at their toe pads. That's Jason scanning the foot of a lizard. We also had a contraption to measure the color of their dewlap, which I'm not going to talk about, but to get a very high resolution measure of their color. Well, here is the hind limb length of the species of the populations. The 0 is the source population, so you can see again the founder effect in limb length. They do vary as a result of which particular individuals got on the island. So our prediction is that they will get shorter legs. And sure enough, they did. All 7 populations evolved shorter legs, just as predicted. However, here's the founder effect. Here's the difference in the populations at the start of the experiment. And you can see more or less those differences persist. So even in the presence of adaptation to a new environment, the founder differences persist at least for a few years. And so what this showed is that founder effects, at least over the course of this study, do occur, and they do persist even in the presence of adaptation. And here's just to show you the extent of what we found compared to the plasticity study. These are pretty big differences compared to other populations we've studied. Oh, I'm sorry, this is before and after. Anyway, you can guess what happened. These populations also got wiped out by, most of them by hurricanes. So hurricanes, I'm a little sick of hurricanes, but it turns out that we've become real experts on the effect of hurricanes on islands. Now, so finally, I want to quickly end with two encores of recent work that are a little bit off the main course of this experiment, and they're work done by postdocs in my lab primarily. The first one is done by this guy, Oriol LaPiedra. He's now in Catalonia, but he was a postdoc in the lab for several years. He had the idea that maybe lizards vary in their behavior, and that behavior might affect their ability to survive in the presence of predators. My role in this project was to tell him that it would never work and beg him not to do it, but he insisted on doing this experiment, and as you'll see, it worked out pretty well. So here's his idea, that there's a trade-off in behavior. Imagine that lizards vary in how willing they are to run down the tree to go capture some food. On the one hand, those that are more willing to do that, they'll get more food, but they're also at greater risk of being eaten. And so you can imagine, suppose you have a population where individuals vary in their propensity to run down the tree and capture prey. In the absence of predators, the guys who are more likely to do it, the guys and gals, would do better, they'd get more food, so evolution would favor being more willing to do that. But in the presence of predators, you could imagine it goes the other way around. These ones are more likely to get eaten by the predator, and so evolution would favor more cautious, perhaps we'd call them, lizards. So Oriol decided to do an experiment to see if that actually happens. And what he did was he went to our study site and he caught almost 300 lizards, and he came up with a behavioral assay that basically measured how willing they were to go to places where they might be in danger of predators. And here's how it worked. So he measured their behavior. He captured a lizard, he put it in a box, and he left it in the box for a little while just to acclimate. Then he opens the door to the box, but he puts a curly-tailed lizard, in front of the other lizard. The curly-tailed lizard is in a cage, so he can't do anything, but the anole in the box sees him. And then we take the curly-tailed lizard away, wait a few minutes, and then let the lizard out of the box. And what Oriol measured is how long before the lizard exits the box, so how much did it wait, and because it knew there was a predator there somewhere, it'd seen it, and then how much time does it spend on the ground before climbing up the little tree. So those were its two assays of willingness to be in a risky situation. Now, he measured each lizard multiple times to ask, is this a repeatable trait? It turns out it's pretty repeatable, that lizards behave the same way in multiple trials. So he measured these lizards' behavior, also their morphology. He tagged each lizard in the way that I mentioned before. Each lizard was individually identified. And then he let them go on one of 8 islands. Now, 4 of those islands only had brown anoles, but 4 islands had brown anoles and curly-tailed lizards. So the question is, does the behavioral effect of the lizard, is it affected by the presence of the curly-tails? Well, just as in our previous studies, survival was lower in the presence of the curly-tails, so they were eating some, and the lizards in the presence of the curly-tails perched higher. Same result we've been seeing before. So, does the variation in behavior affect survival? Well, what we found was in the absence of curly-tails, the islands without curly-tails, this basically is a measurement of survival probability, and there was no effect on how much time they spent on the ground. But in the presence of curly-tails, there was a strong effect. Those that spent a lot of time out in the open before climbing up the tree survived much less well. The ones who quickly ran up the tree survived better. So in other words, natural selection in the presence of predators was different in the absence of predators. And the same was true in the other measure, although in a different way. In this case, if you exited the box very quickly, if you waited a long time, you didn't survive as well, perhaps because you weren't getting as much to eat when there were no predators around. But in the presence of predators, there was no effect. Well, the bottom line is this is very exciting. It shows that natural selection caused by predators could actually, did operate on behavior and potentially could lead to evolutionary change over time. Oriol has got some data suggesting that there may be a genetic basis for the behavior. It's a suggestion at this point. At this point, I need to acknowledge some sad news. Undoubtedly, you've all heard about Hurricane Dorian, which just devastated the Bahamas and Florida in recent weeks. It devastated our study site. We were based right here in Marsh Harbor. And Marsh Harbor is the place you've been seeing pictures of the whole town just being destroyed, which is just tragic. And having worked there for 20 years, it's very hard to look at those pictures. It's very sad, very sad. However, that probably means that this experiment has been wiped out. We don't know. We don't even know when we'll be able to go back and find out. So we just don't know if this experiment is gone or not. So finally, one last story. I'll try to make it quick. One other postdoc, his name is Colin Donahue, also Anthony Harrell from Paris. And this is south of the Bahamas, the islands of the Turks and Caicos, and two particular keys in the Turks and Caicos, Water Key and Pine Key. This had to do with a lizard called Anole scriptus, which is very similar to the brown anole in its biology. It's a very similar lizard. And these islands have been overrun by invasive species, by cats and goats and rats that have dramatically affected the island. And so a group called Fauna and Flora International went down to these islands to remove all the invasive species to allow the ecosystem to recover. So Colin knew about this and said, well, let's see what the lizards do when all these animals are removed, when the vegetation recovers. And so they went down there to measure as baseline data what are the populations on these two islands like, and before the removal occurred. Well, they did this on September 4th, 2 years ago. Hurricane Irma hit those islands 4 days later, and then Hurricane Maria hit it 2 weeks after that. So once again, hurricanes had a tremendous effect on these islands. However, they had really unique data. They had measured these lizards days before the hurricane. So the question was, what was the effect? Had there been natural selection operating as a result of the hurricane? So as soon as they could, 6 weeks later, they went back down and re-measured the lizard populations. And here's what they found. Much to, I think, well, my surprise, if not theirs, the lizards had larger toe pads after the hurricane on both the fore and the hind leg. So there were differences in the populations over a 6-week before and after period. The limb lengths were also different. Fore limbs were longer, hind limbs were shorter. So this suggests the possibility that hurricane-caused natural selection was occurring. That's the hypothesis. And what was particularly convincing is that the changes were the same on these two islands, suggesting a general result. If it had been one island and not the other, maybe it's some sort of fluke, but pretty much the same outcome on both islands. However, and I should say there was one other evidence that natural selection had occurred, and that is if natural selection occurred, you would expect there to be reduced variation in the population afterwards. And that's exactly what we found. Most of the characters we looked at showed decreased variance in support of the idea that maybe selection had been operating. Now, two questions. The first question is, what might have caused these shifts in toe pad size? Was it the actual hurricane winds themselves, or was it something else? Because after the hurricane, the environment was very different. Vegetation was destroyed. Perhaps there was not enough food around. Maybe there was difference in predators. We don't know. We looked at every trait we could think of and found no differences except in the toe pads and the limb length. And so that suggests that it was perhaps the wind itself, the ability to hang on during the hurricane. Now, the other question, though, is could these changes be an artifact? And I have to acknowledge that in an ideal world, we would have marked the lizards beforehand, so we could have seen who had survived and who hadn't, and then could have really told whether the lizards with bigger toe pads had survived better. But this was not an experiment. We didn't know a hurricane was coming, so they didn't do that. So all we could look is what the population was like before, what it was like after, and they did shift. Are there other explanations besides natural selection caused by the hurricane? Well, we can think of some explanations. Perhaps there were lizards with different morphologies that lived in a part of the environment that we hadn't sampled that now were more apparent. It's possible. These guys are very experienced lizard catchers, and it's not a very complicated environment, so that seems unlikely. Perhaps lizards that were different in morphology migrated from elsewhere in the island after the hurricane. Again, seems implausible, but possible. Although in both of those cases, the influx of new lizards with new morphology should have increased the variance in the population, not decreased it. I mean, we could even imagine that lizards got blown in the hurricane from other islands entirely. It actually could happen. But again, I can't rule that out, but the variation was curtailed, not increased. Another possibility, perhaps phenotypic plasticity perhaps hanging on in the winds, you actually pulled your arms longer or made the toe pads bigger. It would have had to have been a very quick response because they were measured 6 weeks later. Phenotypic plasticity has been shown in a variety of traits, but usually over longer periods. Again, it seems implausible. So we somewhat tentatively conclude that perhaps natural selection operating as a result of hurricanes actually is an agent of selection favoring better clinging capability in these lizards. Now, interestingly, or hypothetically, conjecturally, one thing that we know is that lizards on the Caribbean islands have larger toe pads than lizards on the mainland. And the mainland generally doesn't get hit by hurricanes. This suggests the possibility, maybe that's why Caribbean lizards have bigger toe pads, because they get hit by hurricanes every now and then. It's certainly just a conjecture, but it does follow from this line of argument. Well, very interesting findings. It certainly would be nice to follow up in future days. So that is the end of my talk. I do want to basically point out that hurricanes have become a theme of my research, certainly something I never set out to study, but I've become a little bit of an expert on them, and just shows you how things happen when you spend your life studying things. More generally, though, hurricanes are just one of many different ways that the environment is changing. We are changing the world. We know it's getting warmer, with pollution, and so on and so forth. And that's why centers like CBEST are so important, and why it's important to have a group with experts in many different areas so we can study the many different insults we're exposing the natural world to do and to see the interactions among them. So again, I just want to conclude by saying that it's a great honor to be here for the launch of CBEST, and it's a fabulous new center, and I look forward to seeing all the great things it accomplishes. So thank you very much for your attention. Anyone has any questions? Any questions out there? Yes.
Thanks for doing this talk. I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about the natural colonization ability of these lizards from one island to another. Does that really happen more after hurricanes, or are these harms to that?
So the question is about the natural colonization of lizards, and do they actually happen after hurricanes in particular? I will say two things. One, in general, we've been visiting a lot of islands for many years, and we have seen islands that were empty for many years, lizards show up periodically. So we know it does occur, not at a tremendous rate, but it does occur. It has been conjectured that hurricanes, as well as being so destructive, also may be a force for moving lizards around. The hurricane that we were present for, when we went back out in the water was just full of debris, just branches and trees and all kinds of things. We didn't look as hard as we might have, but you can certainly imagine a lizard hanging onto a tree, floating out and getting to these islands. In fact, we found some spiders that undoubtedly had gotten to our islands from the bigger island, because you never only found them on the bigger island before, that were there right after the hurricane. Of course, those are spiders. But I think that these lizards can float, and they can swim. There's no doubt that they can colonize. I think it's very plausible that hurricanes can move them around, and in some cases, some of them might just happen to land on another island. So I think it's possible. Any other questions?
Actually, a good one. I know you focus on the lizards, but was there ever any follow-up to like the tennis players, study that they did? Did they find out that there actually was something behind that, or did they kind of say, yeah, they have long arms?
Well, that's a fascinating question. Might make a great honors thesis, or I don't think it's ever been followed up on. That study actually was from the 1950s, and as far as I'm aware, it's not a literature I keep up on, but I'm unaware that anyone has ever done more work on that. And why just tennis players? What about baseball pitchers or all kinds of things? You would think actually those data, somebody would have something like that, but I'm unaware of it.
So with the target species, when they were evading the larger lizards, avoiding predation, did they expose themselves more to birds? How would you measure or account for evasion of one predator, maybe making you subject to a second or third one?
That's a very good question, and it's certainly very possible that that was happening. The islands we happen to work on don't actually have a lot of bird predators on them, and so we've never seen bird predation on these islands. And there are mockingbirds occasionally, red-winged blackbirds, but it's certainly possible that they do that. I don't have more of an answer than that. I can tell you as a tangent that one of the things we discovered is that on the islands with the predators, when they bob their heads, if this is a lizard's head, they're bobbing their heads less, and presumably to avoid attracting the curly tails or other predators, and that may have interesting knock-on consequences of its own. But that would be very interesting to see how multiple, if there is an interaction between different types of predators.
So I was just wondering, Jonathan, one of your follow-up experiments, if the small islands were on the protected side of the main island, they retained lizards after a hurricane. If they were on the exposed side, they lost them all.
Yes.
So in general, if you do surveys of empty islands, you would predict they would generally be on the exposed sides of larger islands. Is that true?
Yes, but hurricanes come in they don't necessarily always come in the same direction. I think there is. Well, but on the local level, it depends the exact direction. It also depends sort of how close it is and whether you're hit, by the front end or the back end. I mean, a glancing blow can send the water in different directions. So there are actually records of all the hurricanes that have hit the Caribbean in the last 70 years. In fact, Colin Donahue, my postdoc, has gotten hold of those to look at that. But I do think that although there are general patterns, they can kind of come at the islands from many different directions. So before we individually identified them, how did we know? What we would do every year is we would go out and basically we would take spray guns with non-toxic paint, and we would go out and spray every lizard that we saw. On day one, we would spray it yellow. On day two, we would spray it red. I mean, the days, Matt, Day three, green. And then using statistical models, you can, how many lizards you only saw on one day, how many you saw on, what you got on 2 days, how many you got on all 3 days. You can feed it into a mark recapture model and estimate the population size. You're basically estimating how many lizards you missed at all. And so that's how we did it, mark recapture methods. Which turns out to be a lot of fun, actually, to spray them. And, as soon as they shed their skin, it's gone.